Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 45 of Contemplating Life. This week we continue to reminisce about my college days. Today we focus on my dear late friend, Mike Gregory. If you'd asked me a few weeks ago where and when I met Mike, I would have said it was in my physics classes, because that's my fondest memories of him. But my transcript says I didn't take physics until my fourth semester. According to that transcript, the first semester class I've not yet described is Principles of Sociology, S-161. One of the main sections of that course was describing how cities have evolved. I distinctly remember Mike and I having a conversation with the professor about the 1972 sci-fi novel The World Inside by Robert Silverberg. The story is set in the year 2381. People live in 1,000-story tall buildings, 3 kilometers high. The buildings are divided into separate cities over groups of floors. And there's sort of a caste system in which the rich and powerful live on the upper floors and the lower classes live further down. Mike and I had both been fans of the book and thought it explored some interesting concepts. We discussed those with the professor. But for our purposes today, I just tell that because it verifies that Mike and I met in that first semester sociology class. Mike had a huge personality. He was a very outgoing kind of person, could easily be described as the life of the party. He had a big, hearty laugh that could fill the room. Mike was a few years older than me. After high school, he did a few years of duty in the Navy and traveled the world. He was also an avid photographer. One time we got together and he showed me slideshows of all the places he had been. Mike was a consummate BS artist at his core. He loved telling a story about how he got to be a communication operator in the Navy. Military messages were transmitted by teletype between different Navy bases and even ships at sea. In order to qualify for the position in communications, he had to take a typing test. A teletype machine is basically an electric typewriter connected over phone lines. It uses an ordinary typewriter ribbon. But rather than having hammers like a typewriter, there's a cylinder that moves up and down and spins around, similar to the ball on the old IBM Selectric typewriters. You didn't put individual sheets of paper into the machine. There was a continuous roll of paper mounted on the back that would feed into it. Typically, it was cheap paper, sort of a cream-colored newsprint. In order to pass the typing test, he had to be able to type 30 words per minute for an entire page with no more than 2 mistakes. That's a pretty liberal standard. They gave them the text that they were going to type in advance so they could practice typing the exact words that would be on the test. So Mike went into the room the night before the test, rolled a bunch of paper to the machine, and then carefully typed the assignment onto the roll. Then he rolled the paper backwards onto the roll where it was hidden. When it came time for the test, he rigged the typewriter ribbon so that it wouldn't print. The instructor started the test, and he began randomly banging on the keyboard. The print head moved across the page, making a lots of teletype noise, and he just had to hit return at the end of the line. He wasn't really typing anything, but a bell would ding, so he knew when to hit return. It wasn't printing anything, just making noise. When the test was over, he cranked the page up, revealing his pre-typed assignment. He had deliberately included one mistake so it wouldn't look so obvious, and he passed the test. Of course, eventually he had to learn how to type well enough to do the job, but at least he got his foot in the door in a non-combat position during the Vietnam War. I previously spoke about the lunchroom at the Cranit Building on the 38th Street campus. Mike was one of a group of about a dozen people who hung out there anytime we were not in class. A euchre game would start up sometime in the morning and would often last well past dinner. If you had to go to class, there was always someone who would take your seat, and the game would continue. After playing for hours, someone would say, "Well, guess I better go do some homework, or it's time to go to class." About 10 minutes later, they'd say, "Am I at class yet?" "No, you're still here playing cards," we'd reply. Eventually, we had to go to class or to study, but the euchre game was a tough place to get away from. At one point, Mike and I developed signals to each other to let each other know what suit we wanted called. If you put your knuckle down on the table, that meant you wanted clubs. I would tap my ring on the table for diamonds. I don't recall what the other signals were. We finally got caught and had to discontinue the practice. My fondest memories with Mike were in physics class. We were in at least 3, perhaps 4 physics classes together. Now, I spoke previously in episode 15 about Mike and those classes, when I talked about my kindergarten girlfriend who had no arms. She grew up to have a very well-endowed chest, and I talked about the principles of physics, where normally when you walk, you swing your arms to counterbalance your rotational energy from your swinging hips. Mike and I figured out that because she had no arms to swing, the rotational inertia was absorbed by her bouncy boobs. Mike referred to them as coupled harmonic oscillators, a term we used in physics class to denote 2 objects connected by a spring. I'll link that episode in the description in case you missed it. In one of our physics classes, the professor would call the roll and take attendance every day. You would answer him by telling him how many of the homework problems you had been able to work the night before. Typically, we had 3 or 4 problems. One day, just before class began, I turned to Mike and asked, how many problems were we supposed to do last night?" "What, you didn't do your homework?" "We had 3 problems." I replied, "Well, I guess I must have got 2 of them right." In the same way that he had deliberately made a mistake on his typing test so as not to raise suspicion, I didn't want to brag saying I could do all 3 problems, so I dialed back that by 1 and claimed I'd only done 2. The professor must have decided to call the roll in reverse alphabetical order that day, because I was the first one he asked. I proudly answered, "I got 2 of them right." "Very good, Mr. Young." He continued to call the roll. Much to my surprise and distress, it seemed like the average answer among my classmates was only 1 problem, and several of them admitted they were unable to work any of the problems even though they'd tried. Apparently, the homework that day was especially difficult. He then chose one of the problems for someone to work in front of the class. He called on me. I said, that was the one I missed." Someone else went to the blackboard and worked the problem. When they finished, the professor turned to me and asked, "You understand it now, Mr. Young?" "Yes, sir." Mike could hardly keep from laughing. He leaned over and whispered to me, "You know, Chris, a few years from now, when they hand you that diploma with the letters BS on it, you're really going to have earned it." I said, "Hey, I learned BS from the master, Mr. I can type 30 words per minute." Mike and I enjoyed lots of nerdy physics humor, but in order to understand these jokes, I need to dig into some pretty obscure physics principles, so bear with me. In electromagnetic waves, such as radio waves or light waves, the frequency of their energy is denoted by the Greek letter nu. The formula for computing frequency is C divided by lambda, or most commonly read as C over lambda. In this formula, C is the speed of light, and lambda is the wavelength. So whenever I would greet Mike, I would ask, "What's new?" And he would reply, "C over lambda." The other physics joke we enjoyed was, "What's a joule per second?" The answer is true. The joke is that it's not watt, W-H-A-T, rather it's the unit of energy, a watt, W-A-T-T. You've probably seen your electric bill measured in kilowatts. A watt is defined as 1 joule of energy per second. So literally, a watt is a joule per second. What's a joule per second? True. The next one is even more obscure, so bear with me again. In mathematics, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. That's because when you multiply two negative numbers, you always get a positive number. And if you multiply two positive numbers, you always get a positive number. So you can't do the square root of a negative number. But mathematicians and engineers have found the need to deal with square roots of negatives. So they invented an entirely new system of numbers, appropriately called imaginary numbers. Now, while mathematicians generally refer to the square root of -1 with the letter I, engineers and physicists sometimes use the letter J. Don't ask me why the difference. I have no idea. If you take the square of that imaginary number, regardless of whether you call it I or J, the answer is -1. Therefore, J squared is -1. Mike seemed to be fascinated with the letter J in this context. Whenever someone was doing something the opposite of what would be expected, he referred to it as J squared thinking, or perhaps a J squared way of doing things. The rest of us, not so geekily inclined, would just say something like, he's doing it bass-ackwards. But for Mike, it was always J squared this or J squared that. So, I told you that story, so I can tell you this one. One summer, Mike was visiting me and my family at our lakeside cabin in southern Indiana on Quoted Lake. We had a boat dock with an upper platform that was about 10 feet off the water. Those who dared enjoyed jumping off the upper level of the dock. That particular weekend, one of my sisters had a bunch of her friends visiting. Or I don't know, it might have been friends from neighboring cabins. I don't recall. But they were all horsing around and chasing each other around the upper dock platform and trying to push one another into the water. Occasionally, Mike would get into it, grab one of them, and toss them into the water. Now, I was sitting on the lake in the water in my floating lawn chair, about 10 feet out from the dock, enjoying the show. Mike was sitting on the edge of the dock, and one of the kids tried to sneak up behind him to dump him over the edge. Although the kids signaled me to keep quiet, I wasn't going to cooperate. I said, "Oh, Michael." I never called him that, by the way. It was always Mike. "Yes, my good sir," he replied, mimicking my formality. "J squared U," I said. Without turning around or looking, he immediately reached behind him, grabbed the kid who was sneaking up on him, and tossed him into the water. The kid came up out of the water, looking at me wondering, what the hell did you say to him that he knew to look behind him? Mike understood exactly what I was saying. In his own private parlance, J squared meant backward or behind. Saying J squared U was code for look out behind you. Now, it's not like we had this code prearranged. Mike and I could just talk to each other in geek speak, and we knew what the other was saying. Mike took a variety of jobs around campus to support himself. At one point, he was working in the basement with one of the physics professors as a lab assistant. They had built something I'd never heard of. It was a gadget called a magnetic resonance imaging device, or an MRI machine. They were using it to scan lab animals. Mike told me that someday MRI machines would replace or at least supplement X-rays to help doctors look inside your body. Now, I don't know that the work that they did produced any major breakthroughs, but they were working on the technology way before it was commonplace, like it is today. One day I was hanging out with Mike in the lab where I worked, and he had just unpacked a bunch of supplies that had been wrapped in bubble wrap. Now, we all know how addictive it can be to pop bubble wrap. You just squeeze the bubbles with your hand and make a nice, satisfying little popping sound. He had a strip of it about 8 inches wide and perhaps 6 or 8 feet long. I had him lay it out on the floor and aimed my wheelchair so that my left side wheels lined up perfectly with it. I took a running charge at it in my wheelchair. The heavy weight of my motorized chair on the tile and concrete floor made a horrendous popping sound, easily as loud as firecrackers going off. I got about 4 feet into the run before I could get stopped because it was making so much noise. Then I had to figure out how to turn sideways and get off of it without making even more noise. We closed the lab room door, and I slowly maneuvered off of it, trying to minimize the sound. We expected people would come running any minute to see what the hell had happened, or perhaps panic and call the police to report gunfire. But fortunately, in the early 70s, things like active shooters on college campuses were not a thing. Had we done it today, I'm sure it would have caused a panic. By the way, for 4.5 years of attending IUPUI, I don't know that I ever saw any campus security, at least not at 38th Street. There might have been some at the downtown campus, but they were probably just handing out parking tickets to people that didn't have the proper stickers. I may have seen some other officers downtown, but they were probably just Indianapolis police officers taking criminal justice classes and not actual school security. Mike dropped out of IUPUI before completing his degree. I never knew if he ran out of money or if his grades weren't good enough, but he continued to work for a few months at some research institute that was housed in the A building on 38th Street. It was just mindless grunt work. He would Xerox abstracts of scientific articles out of journals and then cut them up and paste them into notebooks. Of course, there were no searchable computer databases in those days for looking up articles. Eventually, Mike found a job in Baltimore and moved there. His background in communication in the Navy landed him a job with NASA or one of its affiliate agencies. He would sit at a console and type commands to a satellite known as the High Energy Astronomy Observatory, or HEO. Scientists would bring him the coordinates of what they wanted to observe in the sky. He would prepare the commands to uplink to the satellite when it passed over the ground station, approximately every 90 minutes. When the satellite would go overhead, he would initiate commands to download the previous data, and then he would upload new commands. Now that only took about 15 minutes coming and going. For the rest of that 90 minutes, he had nothing to do. He was sitting there in the office and was able to make unlimited long-distance phone calls. So he would call me up, and we'd just talk for about an hour. Then he'd say, "Well, got another satellite pass coming up. I better go." Eventually, we lost touch. Sometimes he'd come back to Indy to visit family, and we'd have a little reunion with him and a few other friends from IUPUI, such as Rich and Kathy Logan and Frank Williams. At one visit, he told me he was being interviewed for a new government job in satellite communication. We wished him luck. A couple of weeks later, there was a knock at my door. A 40-something-year-old guy in a gray suit flopped open his ID to show me FBI credentials. He said he was doing a background check on some guy named Michael Leland Gregory. He wanted to know, did we attend IUPUI together? He said he was just verifying his education, and Mike had used me as a reference. I told the guy a lot of nice things about Mike. I told him he was a stand-up guy, and I trusted him with my life, which was true. One day when the elevator went out in the K building, Mike, Rich, and maybe a couple other guys had to carry me down about a flight and a half of stairs. I mentioned to the FBI guy that I'd seen Mike just a few weeks ago when he was in town. The man suspiciously replied, "Oh, I did not know he had been here." Okay, that was creepy. After the guy left, I called Mike to tell him about it. I said, I never told him all the dirt I had on you, such as certain typing tests you allegedly passed. I could have ruined your security clearance and said something like, "Yeah, I knew Mike from our days in the chemistry lab making napalm for the local Communist Party. Whoops. Hey, FBI, if you're wiretapping us, that was just a joke." We both laughed pretty hard. Neither of us ever took chemistry. Mike said he had used me as a reference when applying for the job. But when I told him about the guy suspiciously saying, "I didn't know he was here in Indy," Mike was similarly suspicious. He wondered if the guy was legitimate. I certainly couldn't tell from a brief look whether or not someone's FBI credentials were real. Hell, I don't know if I could tell if they were real from a really long look. What the hell do I know about FBI credentials? Mike had just broken up with a girlfriend or a wife, I forget which, and he thought perhaps the guy might have been a private investigator hired by his ex to check up on him. We never did find out, but Mike did get the job. Now, I don't know if it was a particular job that this FBI agent was clearing him for, but eventually Mike moved to Florida, working for a NASA contractor. He claimed he had actually spent time crawling around in the lower deck and the nose of the space shuttle, swapping out equipment. Well, Mike was indeed a BS artist, and I would not have been surprised if he had done some fast talking to get into such a cool job. I don't think he would have lied to me and exaggerated about that particular experience. We lost touch for many years, but he ended up back in the D.C. area, married to a wonderful woman named Ravel. We connected several years ago via Facebook and exchanged regular emails and an occasional video chat. He was still an avid photographer, and one year as a Christmas present, he mailed out customized calendars featuring his own photographs. They were really amazing. Mike was also an astronomy buff and had a very nice telescope. He was going to purchase an accessory case to hold some lens filters. He discovered the case he was about to purchase online was actually just 3D printed by somebody. It wasn't professionally made. He asked if I could 3D print one for him. He sent me the dimensions, and I was going to design and build it. But then he got to thinking about all the other things he could do with a 3D printer, and he decided to get one for himself. He first bought some cheap Chinese kit and put it together, but couldn't get it to work. Then he gave it to a friend who got it working, which that kind of pissed him off. In the interim, he ordered an Ultimaker 3, which was about a $3,000 3D printer at the time. I was pretty jealous. I had some clunky old printer bot at the time. Here I got him into the hobby of 3D printing, and now he was running a better machine than I had. Now, I don't know if he ever built that filter case, but he got into another major 3D printed project. He built an open-source 3D printed humanoid robot known as the InMove robot. It consisted of a torso, 2 arms, and a head. It had cameras for computer vision, sound capability, and pressure sensors. It would respond to spoken commands or commands sent via a web page. He sent me a YouTube short of the robot where he asked, "How do you feel?" And the robot starts singing "New York, New York," and it gestures with its arms in time with the music. I've included a link to that video in the description. When Mike and I first reconnected on Facebook, he was excited he was getting a new job working for the Navy, writing technical documentation for some sort of Navy project. But after he got the job, he said they really didn't have anything for him to do. I don't know how long he stayed in the job, but eventually he had to quit because he had health problems. Mike developed multiple myeloma brain tumors. He kept it under control for several years through medications. He said he would go in every few weeks to get some sort of chemotherapy or medication that would make him about half goofy for 2 or 3 days. Of course, I replied, only half goofy as opposed to the totally goofy you normally are? All right, smartass, goofier than usual. We didn't really correspond a lot. It wasn't unusual that we would not message each other for several months at a time, because he wasn't a very avid Facebook user. I looked back, and over the course of 2020 and 2021, I sent him several Facebook Messenger messages saying, haven't heard from you in a long time, hope everything's okay. But they all went unanswered. But I didn't really worry about it because, like I said, he wasn't on Facebook very often. Then in July 2022, when he still wasn't answering messages, I found his wife on Facebook and sent her a Facebook message asking about him. She replied, quote, Chris, I'm so sorry. I thought I'd contacted you earlier. Mike passed away on January 3rd. That would be 2022. After being in the hospital with pneumonia and C. difficile. Then he came home to hospice and died at home. He fought the good fight, but the multiple myeloma was stronger. End quote. Interviewer James Lipton famously asked his guests, if heaven exists, what would you say to God when you get there? Now, I'll probably answer the Lipton questionnaire some other time. But let me say today that if heaven exists, I know what I'm going to say to Mike. I'll ask, as always, what's new? And presuming the equations of physics still apply in heaven, I can't wait to hear him say, C over lambda. For now, all I can do is quote Mr. Spock and say that Mike has been and always will be my friend. Rest in peace, my friend. In next week's episode, I finally get to take a programming class in my second semester at IUPUI. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although I have some financial struggles, I'm not really in this for the money. Still, every little bit helps. Many thanks to my financial supporters. Your support pays for the writing seminar I attend and many other things. But most of all, it shows how much you care and appreciate what I'm doing. Your support means more to me than I could ever express. Even if you cannot provide financial support, I'm begging you, as always, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to be able to hear my stories. Stories about great people like my dear friend Mike. All of my back episodes are available, and I encourage you to check them out if you're new to the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you find this podcast. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.